the United States operates a prison designed to hold the most dangerous inmates in the federal system. It stands in the high desert of southern Colorado, isolated from surrounding communities. The facility is called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, commonly known as ADX Florence. It is built to impose total control. It is also the subject of multiple federal lawsuits alleging serious medical and mental health neglect. From the outside, ADX Florence appears quiet and orderly. From the inside, court records describe an environment where access to medical care is limited, delayed, and sometimes denied altogether. The lawsuits do not focus on violence or escape attempts. They focus on something more procedural and more troubling: the failure to provide adequate health care to people held in extreme isolation. ADX Florence opens in 1994. The Bureau of Prisons builds it to manage inmates considered too dangerous for any other federal facility. These include prisoners who assault staff, lead criminal organizations, or continue directing violence from behind bars. The prison's design reflects that mission. Cells are constructed from poured concrete. Doors are solid steel. Windows are narrow and fixed. Movement is tightly scheduled and strictly supervised. Most inmates at ADX spend between 23 and 24 hours a day alone in their cells. Meals are passed through slots. Communication with staff occurs through doors. Recreation, when allowed, takes place in isolated concrete enclosures. Contact with other prisoners is almost non-existent. For many inmates, these conditions last for years. Under federal law, incarceration does not remove the government's obligation to provide medical care. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Courts have long interpreted that to mean prisons must not show deliberate indifference to serious medical needs. This includes physical illness, injury, and mental health conditions. The lawsuits against ADX Florence argue that this standard is not met. Early complaints describe long delays before inmates see medical staff. Prisoners with chronic illnesses report waiting months for routine appointments. Injuries receive minimal attention. Examinations often occur at the cell door rather than in clinical settings. Follow-up care is inconsistent or absent. Medication management becomes a recurring issue in court filings. Inmates allege that prescriptions are delayed, changed without explanation, or stopped abruptly. For prisoners with conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, or neurological disorders, these disruptions have serious consequences. Lawsuits argue that the delays are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern. Mental health care becomes the most significant focus of litigation. Many inmates at ADX arrive with diagnosed psychiatric conditions. Others develop symptoms over time. Prolonged isolation is known to increase the risk of depression, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. Federal lawsuits argue that the prison's isolation model worsens mental illness rather than containing it. Court records describe inmates experiencing psychotic episodes while confined alone for nearly the entire day. Some engage in self-harm. Others withdraw completely, ceasing communication with staff. In some cases, mental health evaluations are brief and conducted through the cell door. There is little opportunity for sustained therapy or meaningful observation. Within the first moments of this story, one point matters. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happens next reveals how this system truly works. The Bureau of Prisons acknowledges that ADX houses individuals who pose extreme security risks. It argues that strict controls are necessary. Movement must be limited. Contact must be regulated. Medical care must operate within those constraints. The Bureau maintains that care is available, but adapted to a high-security environment. Federal judges reviewing the lawsuits do not fully accept that explanation. In multiple rulings, courts state that security concerns do not eliminate constitutional obligations. Isolation does not excuse medical neglect. Extreme custody does not justify deliberate indifference. Judges note that while ADX presents unique challenges, those challenges do not permit systemic failure. One major case reaches federal court in the early 2010s. Prisoners challenge conditions at ADX under the Eighth Amendment, focusing on the treatment of mentally ill inmates. Plaintiffs argue that the Bureau of Prisons knows prolonged isolation causes psychological harm. They argue that the Bureau continues to place mentally ill prisoners in these conditions anyway. Court filings include internal Bureau documents acknowledging the risks associated with long-term solitary confinement. Plaintiffs use these records to show that harm is foreseeable and documented. They argue that mental illness is treated as a security problem rather than a medical emergency. Judges reviewing the evidence express serious concern. They criticize inadequate oversight. They note that policies exist on paper but are not consistently implemented. They find that mentally ill inmates remain in isolation despite clear signs of deterioration. As a result of litigation, the Bureau of Prisons is forced to make changes. Settlements and court orders require that inmates with serious mental illness not remain in long-term isolation at ADX. Instead, they are to be transferred to specialized units or other facilities better equipped to provide treatment. The Bureau must improve screening procedures and conduct more regular mental health evaluations. Placement decisions must be reviewed, and pathways out of isolation must exist. These changes follow years of lawsuits, testimony, and expert analysis. Medical professionals submit evidence describing the effects of prolonged isolation. They cite research linking solitary confinement to worsening psychiatric symptoms. They explain that conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression are aggravated by sensory deprivation and social isolation. The courts do not call for the closure of ADX Florence. They do not dismantle the supermax model. Instead, they impose limits. They emphasize that isolation cannot be indefinite, especially for inmates with serious mental illness. They require the Bureau of Prisons to balance security with basic standards of care. Physical health care remains part of the litigation. Inmates allege that serious injuries are treated with minimal attention. Some describe being examined through the cell door without proper equipment. Others report delays in diagnostic testing. Chronic conditions worsen while prisoners wait for appointments that are postponed repeatedly. Court records also reference staffing shortages. Mental health professionals rotate frequently. Caseloads are heavy. Time per inmate is limited. Even when policies are revised, implementation often lags due to resource constraints. The physical design of ADX compounds these problems. Solid doors limit observation. Communication is restricted. Medical emergencies may not be immediately visible. Response times are slower than in less restrictive facilities. In some cases, inmates die while housed in federal custody. Each death triggers review. Some lead to wrongful death lawsuits. Families allege warning signs were missed and care was delayed. Not every case succeeds in court, but enough do to raise systemic concerns. The Bureau of Prisons disputes many allegations. It points to medical records. It argues that inmates sometimes refuse treatment. It emphasizes the difficulty of providing care in an environment designed for maximum security. Courts acknowledge these challenges but maintain that constitutional standards still apply. Judicial opinions describe the situation in measured but firm language. Judges do not accuse individual staff members of cruelty. They focus on structural failures. Systems that prioritize control over care. Procedures that respond too slowly. Oversight mechanisms that fail to intervene. ADX Florence becomes a reference point in broader debates about solitary confinement across the United States. Advocacy groups cite the lawsuits as evidence that long-term isolation carries serious risks. Other supermax facilities face similar legal challenges. The Bureau of Prisons publicly commits to reform. It updates policies. It conducts additional training. It reports compliance with settlement terms. Oversight increases. Monitoring continues. Whether these reforms fully resolve the issues remains contested. New lawsuits continue to emerge. Advocacy organizations continue to investigate. Experts continue to warn that even limited isolation can cause lasting harm. Former inmates submit affidavits describing long-term effects: difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, impaired social functioning. These accounts appear in legal filings. They are restrained and factual. They describe consequences that persist beyond incarceration. The core issue remains unresolved. Extreme security environments strain healthcare systems. When movement is restricted and contact is limited, medical care becomes harder to deliver. Delays become routine. Symptoms worsen before intervention occurs. The Constitution does not require prisons to be humane in sentiment. It requires them to be humane in practice. At ADX Florence, courts find that line has been crossed at times, particularly for inmates with serious mental illness. The lawsuits do not portray ADX as lawless. They portray it as rigid. A place where systems function as designed, but fail to adapt to human vulnerability. Where illness is managed as a disruption rather than treated as a condition. Federal courts intervene not to weaken security, but to enforce constitutional boundaries. They insist that punishment has limits. They require the Bureau of Prisons to justify its practices with evidence, not assumptions. Inside ADX, life continues under strict control. Doors remain locked. Isolation remains the defining feature. But the legal framework surrounding the prison has changed. Mentally ill inmates are no longer supposed to disappear into indefinite isolation. Medical neglect is no longer dismissed as unavoidable. Courts demand documentation, oversight, and accountability. The story of healthcare neglect at ADX Florence is not dramatic. It is bureaucratic. It unfolds through filings, rulings, and policy revisions. Its impact is measured in medical records and psychological assessments. This is how institutional harm often appears: quiet, procedural, persistent. The lawsuits expose a fundamental tension: security versus care, control versus treatment, efficiency versus humanity. ADX Florence sits at that intersection, and the courts continue to monitor where the balance falls. What remains is a question that extends beyond one prison. How much suffering is acceptable in the name of safety? And who decides when that suffering becomes unconstitutional? If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.